When you enter Marx's room, smoke and tobacco fumes make your eyes water so much that for a moment you seem to be groping about in a cavern, but gradually, as you grow accustomed to the fog, you can make out certain objects which distinguish themselves from the surrounding haze. Everything is dirty and covered with dust, so that to sit down becomes a thoroughly dangerous business. Here is a chair with only 3 legs. On another chair the children are playing at cooking. This chair happens to have 4 legs. This is the one which is offered to the visitor, but the children's cooking has not been wiped away, and if you sit down, you risk a pair of trousers. A family accommodation was so restricted that when Francisca was born in the spring of 1851, she had to be given to a nurse, there being so little room in the house. A year later, she died. At Easter, 1852, wrote Jenny, our little Francisca had a severe bronchitis. For 3 days she was between life and death. She suffered terribly. When she died, we left her lifeless little body in the back room, went into the front room and made our beds on the floor. Our 3 living children lay down by us and we all wept for the little angel whose livid, lifeless body was in the next room. Our beloved child's death occurred at the time of the hardest privations, our German friends being unable to help us just then. Ernest Jones, who paid us long and frequent visits about that time, promised to help us, but he was unable to bring us anything. Anguish in my heart, I hurried to a French emigrant who lived not far away and used to come to see us, and begged him to help us in our terrible necessity. He immediately gave me £2 with the most friendly sympathy. That money was used to pay for the coffin in which my child now rests in peace. She had no cradle when she came into the world and for a long time was refused a last resting place. With what heavy hearts we saw her carried to her grave. In such circumstances it is not surprising that Jenny's physical and moral resources were quickly dissipated. In 1852, in many ways the worst of the Dean Street years, Jenny was frequently confined to bed, emaciated, coughing and, on doctor's orders, drinking a lot of port. Engels had tried to raise money to get her a holiday in the country, but by the autumn she was in bed for days on end, taking a spoonful of brandy hourly. 2 years later she was again ill, but cared for herself on the grounds that the doctor's prescription had only served to make her worse. Since Jenny acted as his secretary, these illnesses hindered Marx in his work. Indeed, she participated to the full in all of Marx's activities. She attended meetings as an observer for him, picked out newspaper articles that she thought might interest him and looked after publishing details when he was away. She was at her most useful when acting as his secretary, writing letters, producing fair copies of his articles for newspapers, his handwriting being illegible, and keeping careful records of the dispatch of his journalism. She was proud of her role as secretary and wrote later, "The memory of the days I spent in his little study copying his scrawled articles is among the happiest of my life." In financial matters, too, Jenny was active. She wrote innumerable begging letters, dealt with the creditors who besieged the house, and even, in August 1850, desperate at the prospect of a 5th child in the future, undertook a trip alone to Marx's uncle, a businessman in Holland. However, the recent revolutionary upheavals had not been good for trade and the old man was in no mood to help his eccentric nephew, so Jenny returned empty-handed. Temperamentally, she was very unpredictable and liable to go to extremes. Marx wrote to her, "I know how infinitely mercurial you are and how the least bit of good news gives you new life." Mercurial was his favorite word in describing Jenny's character, but with the passage of years she found it increasingly difficult not to be submerged by her oppressive surroundings. In the summer of 1850 Marx wrote to Wedemeyer, "You must not take amiss the excited letters of my wife. She is suckling, and our situation here is so extraordinarily miserable that it is pardonable to lose one's patience." At the death of her first child in November 1850 Jenny was quite beside herself and dangerously overwrought. The following year Marx described her as being ill more from bourgeois than physical causes. A few months later he wrote to Engels, "Floods of tears the whole night long tire my patience and make me angry. I feel pity for my wife. Most of the pressure falls on her and basically she is right. Industry must be more productive than marriage. In spite of everything you remember that by nature I am not at all patient and even a little hard, so that from time to time my equanimity disappears." In 1854 Marx spoke of the dangerous condition of my wife. The same year she retreated to bed partly from anger because good Dr. Freund bombarded us once again with dunning letters. The following year for a week my wife has been more ill with nervous excitement than ever before. Of course, much of the housework was taken over by Helene de Muth. Liebknecht wrote of her at this time, 27 years old, and while no beauty, she was nice looking with rather pleasing features. She had no lack of admirers and could have made a good match again and again. She was in many ways the linchpin of the Marx household. Lenchen was the dictator, but Mrs. Marx was the mistress. And Marx submitted as meekly as a lamb to that dictatorship. In the early summer of 1851, Jenny wrote in her autobiography, "An event occurred that I do not wish to relate here in detail, although it greatly contributed to an increase in our worries, both personal and others." This event was the birth of Marx's illegitimate son Frederick. The mother was Helene de Muth. This fact was kept so well concealed, and the surviving papers of the Marx family were so carefully sifted to eliminate all references to it, that only the recent chance discovery of a letter brought it to light. This letter, addressed to August Bebel, was written by Louise Freiberger, the first wife of Karl Kautsky, who had kept house for Engels on the death of Helene de Muth, to whom she had been very close. According to her, Engels had accepted paternity for Frederick and thus saved Marx from a difficult domestic conflict. But he gave Louise Freiberger the right to reveal the truth should he be accused of treating his son shabbily. He even told the story to a distraught Eleanor on his deathbed, writing it on a slate as he had lost his voice. The secret was confined to the Marx family and one or two friends. The son was immediately sent to foster parents and had no contact at all with the Marx household, though he resumed contact with his mother after Marx's death. Louise Freiberger wrote, "He came regularly every week to visit her. Curiously enough, however, he never came in through the front door but always through the kitchen, and only when I came to General and he continued his visits, did I make sure that he had all the rights of a visitor." For Marx's separation from his wife, who was terribly jealous, was always before his eyes. He did not love the boy, he did not dare to do anything for him, the scandal would have been too great. He was sent as paying guest to a Mrs. Lewis, I think that is how she writes her name, and he took his name too from his foster mother, and only after Nim's death adopted the name of de Muth. There is no doubt of the general credibility of this letter. The certificate of Frederick de Muth's birth in June 1851 is conserved in Somerset House. The space for the name of the father is left blank. The name of the mother is given as Helene de Muth and the place of birth as 28 Dean Street. Although so few details of this episode survive, it seems that the necessity of preserving appearances and the fear of the inevitable rumors only served to increase the strain on Jenny's nerves. 5 weeks after the birth, and the day following its registration, Marx wrote to Wade Meyer concerning the unspeakable infamies that my enemies are spreading about me, and continued, "My wife is ill, and she has to endure the most unpleasant bourgeois poverty from morning to night. Her nervous system is undermined, and she gets none the better because every day some idiotic talebearers bring her all the vaporings of the democratic cesspools. The tactlessness of these people is sometimes colossal." Marx described himself as having a hard nature, and Jenny wrote of him in 1850, "He has never, even at the most terrible moments, lost his confidence in the future or his cheerful good humor." But his correspondence with Engels shows that he did not always accept his troubles with so much serenity. In 1852 he wrote, "When I see the sufferings of my wife and my own powerlessness I could rush into the devil's jaws." And 2 years later, "I became wild from time to time, but there is no end to the muck." One undated letter from Jenny to Marx in Manchester gives a glimpse of the state of mind to which she was sometimes reduced. "Meanwhile I sit here and go to pieces. Karl, it is now at its worst pitch. I sit here and almost weep my eyes out and can find no help. My head is disintegrating. For a week I have kept my strength up and now I can no more." In spite of all their difficulties, their basic sympathy and love for each other continued. While staying with Engels in Manchester in 1852, Marx wrote to her, "Dear heart, your letter delighted me very much. You need never be embarrassed to tell me everything. If you, poor darling, have to go through the bitter reality, it is no more than reasonable that I should at least share the suffering in spirit. I hope you will get another £5 this week, or at latest, by Monday." From Manchester again in 1856 he wrote to Jenny, who was in Trier, a letter remarkable both for its sentiments and language and for its being one of the very few surviving from Marx to his wife. The letter is long and the following are some excerpts. "My dearest darling, I have the living image of you in front of me. I hold you in my arms, kiss you from head to foot, fall before you on my knees, and sigh, Madam, I love you. And I love you in fact more than the Moor of Venice ever loved. The false and corrupt world conceives of all men's characters as false and corrupt. Who of my many slanderers and snake-tongued enemies has ever accused me of having a vocation to play the principal role of lover in a second-class theater? And yet it is true. Had the wretches had enough wit, they would have painted the relationships of production and exchange on one side and myself at your feet on the other. Look to this picture and to that, they would have written beneath. But they are stupid wretches, and stupid will they remain in saeculum saeculorum, but love not of Feuerbachian man, not of Molscott's metabolisms, not of the proletariat, but love of one's darling, namely you, makes a man into a man again. In fact, there are many women in the world, and some of them are beautiful. But where can I find another face in which every trait, even every wrinkle, brings back the greatest and sweetest memories of my life? Even my infinite sorrows, my irreplaceable losses, I can read on your sweet countenance, and I kiss my sorrows away when I kiss your sweet face. Buried in your arms, awoken by your kisses, that is, in your arms and by your kisses, and the Brahmins and Pythagoreans can keep their doctrine of reincarnation and Christianity its doctrine of resurrection. For both Marx and Jenny, the final and hardest blow that they suffered in Dean Street was the death, at the age of 8, of their only son in April 1855. Edgar, whom they had nicknamed Mush or Little Fly, was very gifted, but ailing from the day of his birth, a genuine, true child of sorrow, this boy with the magnificent eyes and promising head that was, however, made too large for the weak body. His final illness, a sort of consumption, lasted all through March. By the beginning of April it seemed to be fatal, and Marx wrote on the 6th to Engels, "Poor Mush is no more. He went to sleep, literally, in my arms today between 5 and 6. Liebknecht described the scene, the mother silently weeping, bent over the dead child, Lenchen sobbing beside her, Marx in a terrible agitation, vehemently, almost angrily, rejecting all consolation, the two girls clinging to their mother crying Quidi, the mother clasping them convulsively as if to hold them and defend them against death that had robbed her of her boy. In spite of a holiday in Manchester and the new prospects opened up by Jenny's inheritance, the sorrow remained. At the end of July, Marx wrote to LaSalle. Bacon says that really important men have so many relations with nature and the world that they recover easily from every loss. I do not belong to these important men. The death of my child has deeply shaken my heart and mind, and I still feel the loss as freshly as on the first day. My poor wife is also completely broken down. Years later, Marx still found a visit to the Soho area a shattering experience. Difficulties did not prevent Marx from holding what amounted to an open house. "You were received in the most friendly way," wrote one visitor, "and cordially offered pipes and tobacco and whatever else there may happen to be. And eventually a spirited and agreeable conversation arises to make amends for all the domestic deficiencies, and this makes the discomfort tolerable. Finally you grow accustomed to the company, and find it interesting and original. No relations of either family seem to have come to the rooms in Dean Street, with the exception of Marx's sister Louise, together with the Dutchman she had just married in Trier. But there was a constant stream of other visitors. Harney and his wife, Ernest Jones, Freilagrath and his wife, and Wilhelm Wolff were all regular visitors. The most frequent was a group of young men whose company Marx liked and encouraged. One of this group was Ernst Drank, a founder member of the Communist League who had also worked on the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. He occasionally helped Marx with his secretarial work, but later went into commerce and retired from active politics. Another was Konrad Schramm, who fought a duel with Willich, though Marx quarreled with him in 1851 over Schramm's unwillingness to hand over the Communist League's papers and lost touch when he emigrated to America soon afterwards. A more frequent at Reims, almost daily visitor was Wilhelm Liebknecht, the young philology student who had fought in the Baden Uprising of 1849 and escaped to England via Switzerland. He had a profound, if timid, admiration for Jenny. His own mother had died when he was 3, and loved to run errands for her, look after the children, and generally absorb Marx's ideas with much greater docility than he was later to show in the 1860s and 1870s as leader of the German Social Democrats. Finally, there was Wilhelm Peiper, a young man in his middle 20s who had studied languages in Germany and in the early 1850s stayed with Marx sometimes for weeks on end, when he was not consorting with prostitutes or being employed as a tutor. He acted as Marx's secretary for a time and translated The Poverty of Philosophy into execrable English. He was tactless enough to get on Jenny's nerves, and even to reduce Karl Blind's wife to tears during a discussion on Feuerbach in Marx's room. Marx referred to him as his doctrinaire echo, regretted his schoolmasterish tone, and was pained by his attempts at playing modern music. In spite of all this, he fed Peiper, housed him, helped him recover from illness, got Engels to lend him money and on several occasions even lent him some himself. However unwilling Marx might have been to accept intellectual or party political opposition, in his relations with these younger friends he was usually amused, tolerant and even generous. In his personal relationships Marx could exercise great tact and generosity. He would excuse the shortcomings of his friends to Engels and advise Weidmeyer on how to handle Freilagrath or Wolff. He showed great consideration for the wife of his friend Roland Daniels, one of the defendants in the Cologne trial, organized letters to her from Daniels's friends in England, and on his death in 1855 wrote her a most moving tribute. He even pawned Jenny's last coat to help Icarius when he was ill. The man whose friendship Marx valued most was, of course, Friedrich Engels. For the 20 years following his departure from London in late 1850, Marx and Engels kept up a regular correspondence, writing on the average every other day. Although this correspondence constitutes by far the most important source for any account of Marx's life during these years, it is not complete. The letters were sifted after Engels' death to remove any, for example those concerning Frederick Demuth, which might embarrass family or friends. Thus the almost total absence in the surviving Marx-Engels correspondence of anything indicating a warm friendship between the two men may be attributable partly to this later sifting and partly also to the fact that both correspondents, particularly in the early 1850s, suspected that the authorities were intercepting their letters. Engels' move to Manchester in 1850 meant taking up where he had left off 8 years previously. The split in the Communist League and the failure of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung review removed his chief reason for remaining in London. He had to earn his living, and his mother, to whom he was very attached, urged on him at least an outward reconciliation with his father. There was no representative of the Engels family in the Manchester branch of the firm of Ehrman and Engels, and his father agreed to his acting in the family's interests there. The father's consent was reluctant at first, but it turned to enthusiasm after plans to send his son either to Calcutta or to America had failed, and after Engels had demonstrated in his reports back to Barman his capacity to handle business. Early in 1851 his situation became more permanent, though some difficulties still remained. The problem is, he wrote to Marx, to have an official position as representative of my father vis-a-vis the Ehrmans, and yet have no official position inside the firm here, entailing an obligation to work and a salary from the firm. However, I hope to achieve it. My business letters have enchanted my father and he considers my remaining here a great sacrifice on my part. When his father came over to Britain in July 1851 the matter was settled to the satisfaction of both. Engels was to stay in Manchester for at least 3 years. He later reckoned to have made more than £230 in his first year there. His father, during his annual inspection the following year, drew up a new contract with his partners that provided his son with an increasing proportion of the profits, and by the end of the decade Engels' income was over £1,000 a year. Engels was, as Marx remarked, very exact in matters of money, and this money enabled him to act as Dutch uncle to the entire Marx party. Dronk received money from him, so did Piper. Liebknecht was fitted out, at Engels' expense, with a new set of clothes in which to apply for a tutorship. But the lion's share went to Marx. In some years Engels seems to have given him more than he spent on himself. These sums of money, sometimes sent in postal orders, sometimes in £1 or £5 notes cut in half and sent in separate letters, often saved the unworldly Marx from complete disaster. Karl was frightfully happy, wrote Jenny on one occasion, when he heard the fateful double knock of the postman. "There's Frederick, £2, saved," he cried out. As a result Engels found it difficult to make ends meet and wrote to Marx in 1853, "Reorganization of my personal expenses becomes urgent, and in a week or two I will move into cheaper lodgings and take to weaker drinks." In the previous year, thank God, I got through half of my father's profits in the firm here. As soon as the arrival of my old man approaches, I will move into fine lodgings, produce fine cigars, wine, etc., so that we can create an impression. That's life. Although, as Engels had found previously, the center of English free trade afforded a good vantage point from which to view economic developments, he would have preferred to be elsewhere. Harney declared that he would sooner be hanged in London than live in Manchester, and Engels often complained of his loneliness and boredom. In spite of a plan early in 1852 to move to New Brighton with the entire Marx family, and another scheme in 1854 London as military correspondent of the Daily News, he remained a prisoner in Manchester for 20 years. Several communist friends came to visit him, Worth, who traveled widely for his firm, Dronk, who established himself in Bradford, and above all Marx, who came once or even twice a year, sometimes for weeks on end. He was also able to renew his life with Mary Burns, though concern for respectability prevented his living with her. His work for the Ehrman and Engels business did not keep him from matters of more importance to himself. After a full day's work in his office, he would regularly study languages, military science, hence his nickname General, and write articles in Marx's stead. Engels had a character that was in many ways the exact opposite of Marx's. He was warm, optimistic, well-balanced, full of joie de vivre, and enjoyed the reputation of having a fine taste in all that concerned wine and women. Towards his friends he was loyal, patient and unselfish, and intellectually he had a quick, clear mind, and an ability to simplify, sometimes oversimplify deep and complex questions. In all his surviving correspondence with Marx, Engels only once seems to have reproached Marx, the occasion being Marx's cold reception of the news of Mary Burns's death. The whole correspondence is remarkably unemotional. Although Marx was sometimes angry at Engels' silences, there is only one really abusive letter. Marx had quarreled with Wilhelm Wolff, nicknamed Lupus, over a book that Wolff claimed Marx had borrowed from him and not returned. When Engels' communications became a little less frequent, Marx implied that Engels was putting him in second place to Wolff and drunk. At least, that is the method that you, since the arrival of Mr. Lupus in Manchester, have observed with curious consistency in all matters concerning me and the two gentlemen. It is therefore better, so as not to reduce our correspondence to a purely telegraphic one, for us both to omit all references to your friends and protégés there. When Engels replied in a conciliatory manner, Marx wrote, "You know that everyone has his momentary moods and nihil humani etc. Naturally I never meant conspiracy and such nonsense. You are accustomed to some jealousy, and basically what annoys me is only that we cannot be together, work together, laugh together, while the protégés have you comfortably in their neighborhood." A great crisis was necessary for Marx to put his feelings on paper. When his son was dying in 1855, he wrote to Engels, "I cannot thank you enough for the friendship with which you work in my stead and the sympathy that you feel for the child." And soon afterwards, "In all the frightful sorrows that I have been through in these days, the thought of you and your friendship has always strengthened me, together with the hope that we have still something purposeful to do in the world together." Engels was also on close terms with the rest of the Marx family. He wrote from time to time to Jenny and sent cotton goods as presents, and as Uncle Engels he was very popular with the children. On occasion, however, Marx did criticize Engels, particularly to Jenny. After Marx's death, his daughters Laura and Eleanor removed and destroyed those parts of their parents' correspondence which contained passages that might have hurt Engels. Resumed economic studies. Considering his family circumstances, it is surprising that Marx got any serious work done at all. His one secure refuge was the British Museum. At home he would write up and collate the information he got there. His working habits were no more regular than they had been in Brussels, to judge by the report of a Prussian government spy. In private life he is an extremely disorderly, cynical human being, and a bad host. He leads a real gypsy existence. Washing, grooming and changing his linen are things he does rarely, and he is often drunk. Though he is often idle for days on end, he will work day and night with tireless endurance when he has a great deal of work to do. He has no fixed times for going to sleep and waking up. He often stays up all night, and then lies down fully clothed on the sofa at midday and sleeps till evening, untroubled by the whole world coming and going through the room. Eleanor wrote that she had heard tell how, in the front room in Dean Street, the children would pile up the chairs behind him to represent a coach to which he was harnessed as horse, and would whip him up even as he sat at his desk writing. In spite of all these impediments, Marx began to lay the foundation of his economic work and produce a considerable amount of high-quality journalism. During 1850 to 51 Marx spent long periods in the British Museum, resuming the economic studies that he had been forced to neglect since his Paris days of 1844. In his articles in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung Review he had already analyzed the historical and political conclusions to be drawn from the failure of the 1848 revolutions, the cyclical process of overproduction and consequent overspeculation of 1843 to 45, the financial panic of 1846 to 47, and the recovery in England and France during 1848 to 50. The result of the analyses of the 1848 revolutions was not to make Marx any less sanguine about the next outbreak, but only the circumstances in which it would occur. During the early 1850s Marx did not differ from the other German refugees in London in his belief that a revolution was imminent. He deemed his views in December 1849 in a letter to Watermeyer. Another event And Economics, in July, Literature on the Factory System and Agricultural Incomes, in August, Population, Colonization and the Economics of the Roman World, in the autumn, books on banking, agronomy and technology. In all, Marx filled his notebooks with long passages from about 80 authors and read many more. This study was directed towards the completion of his work on economics. Already in January 1851, Engels was urging Marx to hurry up with the completion and publication of your economics. By April, Marx wrote, "I am so far advanced that in 5 weeks I will be through with the whole economic shit. And that done, I will work over my economics at home and throw myself into another science in the museum. I am beginning to be tired of it." Basically, this science has made no further progress since Ed Smith and D. Ricardo. However much has been done in individual and often very subtle researches, the book was eagerly awaited by Marx's friends. In May, LaSalle wrote, "I have heard that your economics will at last see the light of day. I am burning to contemplate on my desk the giant 3-volume work of the Ricardo-turned-socialist and Hegel-turned-economist." Engels, however, who knew his friend well, declared that as long as you still have not read a book that you think important, you do not get down to writing. In June, however, Marx was as sanguine as ever, writing to Weidmeyer, "I am slogging away mostly from 9 in the morning until 7 in the evening. The stuff I am working on has so many damned ramifications that with every effort I shall not be able to finish for 6 to 8 weeks." Although he realized that one must at some point break off forcibly, in July 1851 Proudhon's new book, The General Idea of Revolution in the 19th Century, came into his hands and he immediately diverted his energies into criticizing its contents. Despite its anti-Jacobinism, Proudhon's book appeared to Marx to deal only with the symptoms of capitalism and not with its essence. However, by October, Freilagrath and Piper, who was traveling in Germany at the time, had interested the publisher Lowenthal in Marx's work. Marx's scheme comprised 3 volumes, a critique of economics, socialism, and a history of economic thought. Lowenthal wished to begin with the last volume and see how it sold. Engels urged Marx to accept this proposal, but to expand the history into 2 volumes. After this would come the Socialists as the 3rd volume, the 4th being the Critique, What Would Be Left of It, and the famous positive, What You Really Want. For people of sufficient intelligence, the indications in the first volumes, the Anti-Proudhon and the Manifesto, will suffice to put them on the right track. The mass of buyers and readers will lose any interest in the history if the great mystery is already revealed in the first volume. They will say, like Hegel in the Phenomenology, I have read the preface and that's where the general idea can be found. Advising Marx to make the book a long one by padding out the history, Engels told him bluntly, show a little commercial sense this time. In early December came Bonaparte's coup d'état, which made Engels anticipate difficulties with Lowenthal, and though Marx stayed in contact with the publisher until well into the following year, nothing came of the negotiations. Even Kinkel was eager to get a positive foundation from Marx's economics, and Lassalle proposed the founding of a company that would issue shares to finance the publication, but Marx doubted the success of the venture and anyway did not wish to make public his lack of resources. In January 1852 he wrote asking Weidmeyer to find him a publisher in America because of the failure in Germany. By this time he had already abandoned work on his economics. He worked on his notebooks for a short period in the summer of 1852 and, as a last hope, submitted to the publisher Brockhaus the project of a book to be entitled Modern Economic Literature in England from 1830 to 1852. Brockhaus rejected it, and Marx, under the pressures of poverty, work for the Cologne Communist trial and increasing journalistic commitments, abandoned his economics for several years. Journalism, the continual newspaper muck annoys me. It takes a lot of time, disperses my efforts, and in the final analysis is nothing. However independent one wishes to be, one is still dependent on the paper and its public, especially if, as I do, one receives cash payment. Purely scientific works are something completely different. This was Marx's view of his journalism in September 1853 when he had already been writing for the New York Daily Tribune for a year. The invitation to write for the newspaper had come from its managing editor, Charles Dana. Dana had a strong and independent personality. Brought up by uncles on the bankruptcy of his father and the death of his mother, he entered Harvard on his own merits, but was forced by lack of means to leave after a year. In 1841 he joined the colony at Brook Farm, which adopted Fourierism and became a phalanstery while he was there, and was one of its most effective members. When the phalanstery was destroyed by fire, Dana was engaged by Horace Greeley as editor of the New York Daily Tribune. The Tribune, founded in 1841, was an extraordinarily influential paper, and the Weekly Tribune, composed of selections from the daily editions, had a circulation of 200,000 throughout America. The policies advocated by the paper and inspired by Greeley were surprisingly radical. It gave much space to Fourierist ideas, favored prohibition and protection, at least as a short-time measure, and opposed the death penalty and slavery. This rather curious mixture of causes often aroused Marx's contempt. The Tribune is of course trumpeting Carey's book with all its might. Both indeed have this in common, that under the guise of Sismondian philanthropic socialistic anti-industrialism they represent the protectionists, i.e., the industrial bourgeoisie of America. This also explains the secret of why the Tribune, in spite of all its isms and socialistic humbug, can be the leading journal in the United States. Dana had met Marx in Cologne in 1848 and been very impressed. In August 1851 he asked Marx to become one of the Tribune's 18 foreign correspondents and write a series of articles on contemporary events in Germany. Marx, who was still thinking of finishing his economics and could not yet write good English, wrote to Engels in the same letter that told him of the Tribune's offer, "If you can manage to let me have an article on the German situation written in English by Friday morning, that would be a great beginning." A week later he wrote, "In the matter of the New York Tribune, you must help me now as I have my hands full with my economics. Write a series of articles on Germany, from 1848 onwards. Witty and straightforward. The gentlemen in the foreign department are very outspoken." Engels complied and the first article appeared in the Tribune in October. In all, 18 articles, all by Engels, were published and were a great success. It may perhaps give you pleasure to know that your articles are read with satisfaction by a considerable number of persons and are widely reproduced. The secret of the authorship was very well kept, and for years the articles were reprinted, under the title Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, with Marx as their author. In April 1852 Dana asked Marx to write regularly for the Tribune on English affairs. Marx wrote in German and sent the manuscript to Engels to be translated. In January 1853, however, he wrote to Engels, "For the first time I've risked writing an article for Dana in English." During the same year, as relations with Russia became tense, Marx enlarged his subject matter and was soon writing about all aspects of world politics. His articles were highly appreciated, and in January 1853 his fee was increased to £2 per article. A contemporary writer described Dana as regularly plunged in the reading of Karl Marx or An American in Paris. At the beginning of 1854 Marx received through Dana an offer from an American magazine for articles on the history of German philosophy from Kant onwards. The articles were to be sarcastic and amusing, and yet to contain nothing which would hurt the religious feelings of the country. Marx wrote to Engels that if they were together it might be possible, but alone I would not wish it, and the matter was not pursued. In the same year, relations between Marx and the Tribune became strained. Dana often altered Marx's articles and sometimes took the first paragraphs of an article to serve as an editorial, printing the rest as a separate and anonymous article. In all, 165 of the Tribune's editorials were taken from Marx's articles, though in fact Dana preferred the articles that, unknown to him, had been written by Engels. Marx insisted that either all or none of the articles should be signed, and after 1855 they were all printed anonymously. During 1853 the Tribune printed 80 of Marx's articles and about the same number in 1854, but only 40 in 1855 and 24 in 1856. At the beginning of 1857, Marx threatened to write for another paper since the Tribune, whose panslavist tendencies were becoming more pronounced, was printing so few of his articles. Dana thereupon agreed to pay him for one article a week, whether printed or not. In April 1857 Dana invited Marx to contribute to the New American Cyclopedia. The Cyclopedia was the idea of George Ripley, a friend of Dana's since Brook Farm and literary editor of the Tribune. It eventually comprised 16 volumes, had more than 300 contributors, and was a tremendous success. A strict objectivity was aimed at, and Dana wrote to Marx that his articles should not give evidence of any partiality, either on political, religious, or philosophical questions. Although Engels saw in Anna's proposition the opportunity we have been waiting for so long to get your head above water, and constructed schemes for getting a number of collaborators together, this proved impossible. Marx was asked to do articles mainly on military history and was severely handicapped when Engels fell ill with glandular trouble. He could give no plausible explanation for the embarrassing delays and was reduced to pretending that the articles had been lost in the post. Most of his contributions were written in 1857 to 58, but he continued to send a few until the end of 1860. At $2 a page it was a useful source of income. The reason for the end of Marx's collaboration is not known. In all, 67 Marx-Engels articles were published in the Cyclopedia, 51 of them written by Engels, though Marx did a certain amount of research for them in the Lyrisches Museum. By the end of 1857 the commercial crisis had compelled the Tribune to dismiss all its foreign correspondents apart from Marx and one other, and in 1861 Greeley, disturbed by Marx's views, asked Dana to sack him also. Dana refused, but the publication of further articles by him was suspended for several months. A few were published at the end of 1861 and the beginning of 1862, but in March 1862 Dana wrote to Marx that the Civil War had come to occupy all the space in the newspaper and asked him to send no more articles. In all the Tribune published 487 articles from Marx, 350 written by him, 125 written by Engels, mostly on military matters, and 12 written in collaboration. Marx's articles were not merely a means of earning his living. In spite of his low opinion of his own work, he consistently produced highly talented pieces of journalism and was, in the words of the Tribune's editor, not only one of the most highly valued, but one of the best paid contributors attached to the journal. Marx was far removed from the conventional sources of news and so made much more use of official reports, statistics, and so on, than the majority of journalists. In addition, he managed to tie a large number of his articles in with his serious research, which gave them added depth. Some of his press articles on India, for example, were incorporated almost verbatim into Capital. Considering the strong views he held, his articles were remarkably detached and objective. In many areas opposition to reactionary European governments, for example, he saw eye to eye with the Tribune and could express himself forcefully, but where there was a divergence he contented himself with the straight facts. Although Marx started writing exclusively on England, about which he was exceptionally well informed, by 1853 he was dealing with Europe too, where the dominant topic was the approach of the Crimean War. Here he was concerned broadly to defend the values of Western European civilization, as expressed in the bourgeois revolutionary movements of 1789 and later, against the Asiatic barbarism of Russia. His almost pathological hatred of Russia led him to his bizarre view of Palmerston as a tool of Russian diplomacy and prompted an exposure, in a series of articles, of Palmerstonian duplicity. Some of these articles were written for the Free Press, run by David Urquhart, a romantic conservative politician whose Russophobe views Marx characterized as subjectively reactionary but objectively revolutionary. In writing for the press, Marx was particularly anxious to combat Herzen's faith in the socialist vocation of Russia and the writings of his old friend and colleague Bruno Bauer, who saw Russian absolutism as the rebirth of Roman statecraft, the incarnation of a living religious principle as opposed to the hollow democracies of the West. This was the one point on which Dana was critical of Marx, considering his attitude to France and Russia as exhibiting too German a tone of feeling for an American newspaper. Marx also devoted a considerable number of articles to the Far East and particularly India. In general, he regarded the phenomenon of colonialism as inevitable since capitalism had to encompass the whole world before it could be overthrown. Like industrialization in the West, it was both progressive and immensely destructive. He wrote, Britain has to fulfill a double mission in India, one destructive, the other regenerating the annihilation of old Asiatic society, and the laying of the material foundation of Western society in Asia. This was particularly so since, 111 Marx's view, Asia had no history of its own. The reason for this lay in 11 mode of production different to that of the West. The necessity of providing vast public works to achieve satisfactory irrigation had led to a highly centralized government built on a substructure of self-contained villages and the entire absence of private property in land. The only changes brought about in India were those caused by invaders, the most recent and fundamental changes being those wrought by British capital, and these, although of no benefit to Britain, would bring India under the general laws of capitalist development.